Here's a sentence that should not be true, and yet for about 100 years, it was the load-bearing fact of American life. In the middle of winter, hundreds of men walked out onto a frozen lake, cut it into bricks with horses and saws, and used those bricks to feed a city 400 miles away, all summer long, without a single mechanical refrigerator anywhere in the chain. No engine, no electricity, no chemical refrigerant. Just a lake, a winter, and a small army willing to risk drowning for a paycheck. You probably think of refrigeration as something that arrived with a plug and a hum, a 20th century convenience that showed up sometime around your grandmother's wedding registry. It didn't. Refrigeration arrived 100 years earlier than that, and it arrived on a sled. The thing that kept your great-great-grandmother's milk from killing her children wasn't a machine. It was a frozen pond, hacked into 2-foot squares by men standing in the cold at 4 in the morning, and floated down a river to a city that had absolutely no idea how close the whole system came to falling apart. This is the story of that system. It's got a Boston eccentric who got thrown into debtor's prison for trying to sell ice to people who'd never seen it. It's got a teenage runaway from a hotel family who invented a tool so simple it embarrasses you that nobody thought of it sooner. It's got 800 men and 1,800 horses converging on a single lake every January like it was a small war. It's got a heat wave that killed more New Yorkers than a hurricane, a riot, and a great fire combined, and a future president handing out free ice from police stations to stop the bleeding. And it's got one of the great forgotten financial scandals in American history. A guy who cornered the market on frozen water, got the mayor of New York into his pocket, and nearly killed the city's poorest children to do it. Before we get into the lake, the Plow, and the man who started it all, if you're into stories where ordinary infrastructure turns out to have an insane, sweaty, occasionally deadly backstory, that's basically the whole channel. Hit subscribe, and if you've got a guess for where this whole industry crumbles, drop it in the comments. I promise you it's not the reason you think. Okay, grab a coat. We're going out on the ice. The man who decided to sell winter start with the dumbest business idea in American history, pitched by a 22-year-old at a family picnic in 1805. Frederic Tudor was lounging on the Massachusetts coast with his brother, eating ice cream and drinking chilled punch, the kind of small seasonal luxury wealthy New England families had quietly enjoyed for generations, a little ice cut from the home pond in winter, packed away in a cellar, hoarded out across the summer for special occasions. Someone made an offhand joke. Wouldn't the sweating colonists down in the Caribbean just love a taste of this? Ha ha, pass the punch. Frederic Tudor did not let it go. He came from money. His father was a prominent Boston lawyer who'd served as George Washington's first judge advocate general, and he'd had every door open to him, including a free ride to Harvard. He turned it down at 13. School bored him, business didn't, and somewhere between that picnic and the following winter, Tudor decided he was going to be the man who sold frozen ponds to the tropics, and he was going to be rich doing it. Here is the part where you're supposed to picture investors nodding thoughtfully. That is not what happened. Tudor went looking for backing and got laughed at. He went looking for a ship to carry his cargo and discovered that not one captain in Boston would touch the job, not out of spite, but out of basic seamanship. A hold full of ice was a hold full of a problem. It would melt. The meltwater would slosh around in the bilge and destabilize the vessel, and if the crew was unlucky, an unstable ship full of half-liquid cargo in open ocean was how you ended up on the bottom of the Atlantic. Nobody wanted the job. So Tudor spent nearly $5,000, the bulk of everything he and his brother had raised, buying his own brig, a vessel called the Favorite, just so he'd have a boat willing to carry his own merchandise. On February 10, 1806, the Favorite cleared Boston Harbor with about 130 tons of ice cut from a pond on the family's land in Saugus, headed for the French island of Martinique, 1,500 miles south. The Boston Gazette covered the departure with the kind of deadpan you'd use for a man setting his own house on fire for the insurance money. No joke. A vessel has cleared at the custom house for Martinique with a cargo of ice. We hope this will not prove a slippery speculation. It proved a slippery speculation. The ice survived the 3-week voyage in remarkably good shape. That part actually worked. The problem was everything downstream of the ice arrived. Martinique had never had ice before. There were no ice houses. There was no cultural concept of how to keep a frozen block frozen, because nobody on the island had ever needed one. Tudor watched, appalled, as the locals he was trying to sell to treated his miracle cargo like a curiosity rather than a commodity, carrying chunks of it through the open air at high noon, setting it on a plate by the front door, and then, predictably, complaining that it melted. One man dunked his piece in a tub of water to preserve it. Tudor would later describe their storage methods with the weary contempt of a man watching someone use a hammer to eat soup as simply laughable. He lost roughly $4,500 on the trip. Then he tried Cuba, lost money there too. By 1812, 6 years and several failed shipments into his ice-selling career, Frederic Tudor was bankrupt and sitting in debtor's prison, a Boston Brahmin's son, Harvard eligible, doing time over a cargo of frozen pond water that nobody on earth seemed to want. This is usually the part of the story where the smart move is to quit. Tudor's own diary, started in those early years, makes it pretty clear he'd already pre-decided against that option. He'd written on the inside cover something to the effect that a man who gives up after the first setback, who despairs of success without striking a second blow, will never be a hero in war, love, or business. It reads less like a motivational poster and more like a man bracing himself in advance for exactly the kind of decade he was about to have. So he kept going. And the thing that finally turned it around for him wasn't a stroke of marketing genius. It was patience applied with an almost unsettling level of stubbornness to the single hardest part of the problem, teaching entire cities, one bartender and one boarding house dinner table at a time, that they wanted something they had never had a reason to want. Tudor's pitch, when he finally nailed it down, was simple and a little bit predatory in the best capitalist tradition: give the first taste away. He traveled from port to port pitching bartenders on serving iced drinks at the exact same price as warm ones, just to see which one people preferred. He didn't have to wonder very hard. He taught restaurant owners how to make ice cream, a luxury dessert that without reliable ice simply could not exist commercially in a hot climate. He went after doctors and hospitals, making the case that ice was a legitimate medical tool for bringing down fevers, not just a rich man's toy. While living in a South Carolina boarding house in 1819, he made a running habit of bringing his own chilled drinks to the communal dinner table, letting his fellow boarders mock him for it right up until they tried a sip. Tudor's own theory of the business, stated with the flat confidence of a man who turned out to be completely correct, was this: a man who has had his drink cold for a week can never be handed a warm one again and feel good about it. It worked, and it worked because he was structurally right. Once a market tasted cold, it didn't go back. He built ice depots in Havana, in Kingston, in Charleston, in New Orleans, established markets one humid port at a time through the 1810s and into the 1820s, slowly turning a humiliating personal disaster into an actual functioning business. Then in 1833, at the age of 50, having already survived bankruptcy and prison, and a decade of being treated as Boston's resident lunatic, Tudor made the single craziest bet of his career. A fellow Boston merchant named Samuel Austin proposed something genuinely absurd: ship ice not across the Caribbean, a 2-week run, but to Calcutta, India, 16,000 miles away. 4 months at sea, through the tropics, across the equator, with absolutely no way to check on the cargo until the ship either showed up or didn't. There was no telegraph yet. There wouldn't be a working transatlantic cable for another 25 years. Once that ship left the dock, it was simply gone, and Tudor would not know if he'd made a fortune or thrown his entire ice empire into the Indian Ocean until the Tuscany either sailed back into Boston Harbor or didn't. On May 12, 1833, the Tuscany left Boston with 180 tons of New England ice in its hold. Back home, the betting in Boston's business circles was that this was finally the stunt that proved Tudor had lost his mind completely. It arrived in Calcutta that September with roughly 100 tons of ice still intact. More than half the cargo had survived a 4-month equatorial crossing in a wooden ship with no mechanical cooling whatsoever, just sawdust, hay, and careful stowage. The British colonial administrators in Calcutta, sweating through their wool uniforms in a climate they'd never adjusted to, lost their minds over it. One curious Indian onlooker reportedly touched a block, recoiled as if burned, wrapped his hand in his robe, and fled the scene to the alarm of everyone watching. For the British expatriates baking in the Bengal heat, on the other hand, it was less a novelty and more a long overdue mercy. Calcutta became Tudor's single most lucrative market, generating an estimated $220,000 in profit over the following 2 decades, somewhere north of $8 million today. That was it. That was the turn. Frederic Tudor, the man Boston's elite had spent a decade quietly laughing at, was now the Ice King, and he had the title, the wealth, and the eventual fortune, somewhere around $200 million in today's money by the time he died in 1864, to make the joke very expensive for everyone who'd told it. But here's the thing about Tudor's success that he himself would have been the first to admit if you'd caught him in an honest mood. The early years of his empire ran almost entirely on hand labor and sheer bullheaded persistence. Men hacking ice out of a pond with axes and saws, one irregular block at a time, hauling it to the dock by sledge. It worked, technically. It was also brutally slow, wildly inefficient, and capped by its very nature at a scale that could never feed something the size of a major American city. What turned Tudor's clever scheme into an actual industrial machine? What made it possible to imagine, decades later, that a single lake could keep New York City's milk from spoiling wasn't Tudor at all. It was one of his own employees, and what he invented was almost embarrassingly simple. The plow that built an industry picture the hardest part of Tudor's whole operation, the bottleneck that nothing else in the business could get around, getting the ice out of the lake in the first place. Before the 1820s, ice harvesting looked almost exactly the way it had looked for farmers cutting their own winter supply for 100 years. Men walked out onto the frozen surface with axes and long handsaws, and they cut blocks by hand, one at a time, in whatever rough shape the saw happened to produce. It was backbreaking, it was slow, and it was wildly inconsistent, irregular chunks of ice in irregular sizes, which meant wasted space in storage, wasted space on ships, and a hard ceiling on how much ice one team of men could physically produce in the roughly 3-week window each winter when a New England pond was thick enough to work, but the season wasn't yet over. Tudor needed volume. What he had was a method that scaled the same way digging a well with a teaspoon scales. The man who fixed this was not, on paper, an obvious candidate for industrial innovation. Nathaniel Jarvis Wyeth came from a prominent Massachusetts family that ran a hotel near Fresh Pond in Cambridge, comfortable, established, entirely unremarkable as a launching pad for reinventing an industry. Selling ice on the side was just a bit of supplemental income for Wyeth, not a calling. But he'd done the hand cutting himself, felt exactly how brutal it was, and being the kind of person who looks at a miserable manual task and immediately starts sketching a way to avoid doing it personally, he had an idea. What if instead of a man with a saw doing all the work, you used a horse? Around 1825, Wyeth built what he called an ice plow, and despite the grandeur the name implies, it was a strange, almost comically minimal piece of equipment. It looked roughly like a farmer's plow, if you stripped a farmer's plow down to its blade and bolted it sideways. A horse, harnessed to the frame, dragged a steel cutting edge across the surface of the ice, scoring a straight groove a couple of inches deep. Run a second parallel blade alongside the first, and you've got 2 grooves at a fixed distance apart. Repeat that in a grid pattern across the entire surface of a pond, and what you've produced, almost by accident, with nothing more sophisticated than a horse walking back and forth in straight lines, is a perfect, uniform checkerboard. The genius of it wasn't the cutting, it was the standardization. Once the grid was scored, you didn't need careful, skilled handwork to finish the job. You needed a saw and a strong back to crack along lines that were already laid out for you, popping out block after identical block, each one roughly the same dimensions as the last. A historian of the early ice trade later calculated what this actually did to the economics of the business. Wyeth's plow cut the cost of harvesting a ton of ice from about 30 cents down to 10. A 2/3 reduction in cost, from a tool that amounted to a sharpened plank dragged by a horse. Tudor noticed. He was impressed enough by the invention that in 1826 he offered Wyeth $500 a year, later raised to $1,200, to formally take charge of the ice harvest at Fresh Pond, an arrangement that let Wyeth walk away from managing his father's hotel and into the considerably stranger career of professional ice baron's lieutenant. Wyeth wasn't done. The plow solved the cutting problem. It didn't solve the hauling problem, which was its own special kind of misery. Getting heavy, slippery, 200-pound blocks of ice up out of the water and into storage, by hand, one at a time, was a separate and exhausting job all its own. His second contribution was a clever bit of mechanical balance. 2 platforms rigged on either end of a long beam, connected through a pulley system, so that as a horse hauled one platform loaded with ice up out of the water and into the ice house, the second platform was simultaneously lowering back down to the surface, empty, ready to be loaded again. One motion did 2 jobs. The whole operation stopped being a series of individual lifts and became something closer to a continuous loop. And then he solved the storage problem, which turned out to matter just as much as the cutting and the hauling combined. Ice harvested in January is useless to a Caribbean rum punch in July unless you can keep it from melting for 6 straight months. and the traditional method, burying it in underground pits, the way root cellars worked, had real limits on scale and consistency. In 1825, Wyeth came up with something different: build the storage structure above ground instead, as a double-walled wooden building, with the gap between the inner and outer walls packed solid with sawdust or straw. Sawdust, conveniently, was a waste product of New England sawmills, meaning the insulating material that made the whole scheme work was essentially free, just sitting around at every mill in the region waiting to be hauled away. It is worth sitting with how counterintuitive this is, because it still trips people up today. The sawdust wasn't keeping the ice cold. Nothing in this system actively chilled anything. There was no refrigerant, no compressor, no mechanism for removing heat. The sawdust's only job was insulation, slowing down the rate at which the outside world's heat could get in. A well-built, well-packed ice house wasn't a freezer. It was closer to a very good thermos, the size of a barn, built specifically to make sure that whatever cold had already been harvested from winter stayed put for as long as humanly possible. Properly stacked and packed, ice in one of these structures could survive clear through summer and into the following winter's harvest, with some unavoidable melt, called shrinkage in the trade, but with most of the cargo intact. Put those three pieces together: the plow that mass-produced uniform blocks, the counterweighted hauling rig that moved them efficiently, and the sawdust-insulated icehouse that kept them frozen for months, and you've gone from a cottage industry that could barely keep one rich family's punch cold to something that could plausibly supply entire cities on entire continents year-round. Wyeth's biographer later noted, with some justification, that it was only once Wyeth took over the operational side of the business that Tudor's ice company actually started turning a real profit. The Ice King's empire ran on Wyeth's engineering. Wyeth, for his part, did not stick around to enjoy the credit. He was a restless man, restless enough that in 1832, at the height of his usefulness to Tudor's ice business, he caught fire for an entirely different obsession: the Oregon country and the wave of westward fur-trapping ambition that the Lewis and Clark expedition had set loose a generation earlier. He joined a society dedicated to encouraging American settlement of Oregon and announced he was leaving the ice trade to go make his fortune trapping furs 3,000 miles away. Tudor, characteristically, didn't try very hard to stop him. He funded part of Wyeth's departure, kept the door open for his return if the West didn't pan out, and bought out the rights to Wyeth's ice plow patent for $2,500 on his way out. It did not pan out. Wyeth's Western expedition was, by most accounts, something close to a disaster. Members of his party died from disease, from violence. The venture never produced the fortune he'd imagined. He came back to Boston in late 1833, found Tudor still running the ice empire Wyeth's own tools had built, and went back to work for him, eventually picking up 14 more patents over the following years for improvements to ice cutting and ice storage machinery before his death in 1856. What matters for our purposes isn't Wyeth's personal arc, it's what his plow set in motion. Within 2 decades of its invention, the volume of ice moving out of New England had exploded. By 1847, roughly 353 ice-laden ships were clearing Boston Harbor annually, carrying cargo not just to the Caribbean and India, but to Rio de Janeiro, to Hong Kong, to virtually every port hot enough to want what New England's winters were producing as a byproduct. Boston alone exported close to 75,000 tons of ice that year. In the years leading up to the Civil War, By one historian's accounting, American ships carried more total tonnage of ice abroad than any export except cotton. Cotton, the defining commodity of the antebellum American economy, and frozen pond water was running it a close second. And this is where the story stops being about exotic export markets and starts being about something closer to home, because the same tools that let Tudor ship ice to Calcutta were almost immediately put to a much less glamorous and far more consequential use, keeping a fast-growing American city fed. New York didn't need ice for novelty cocktails. New York needed ice because it was rapidly becoming the largest, densest urban population in the country, with no functioning system for keeping meat, milk, fish, or butter from spoiling between the farm and the dinner table, and a population that every single summer was going to get sick and die in direct proportion to how badly that problem went unsolved. Up the Hudson River from the city, on a quiet body of water perched above the Palisades, that solution was already taking shape. And it would eventually grow into the single largest ice harvesting operation the country had ever seen, a literal mountain of frozen winter, stacked and waiting, that New Yorkers would come to depend on every single day of their lives, without most of them ever giving it a second thought. A day on the lake, it's 4 a.m. in January, sometime in the 1880s, and you are standing on the shore of Rockland Lake, New York, 25 miles up the Hudson from a city you can't see and won't reach today. It's dark. It's somewhere around 10 degrees, maybe less with the wind coming off the Palisades behind you. And in front of you, lit by a scattering of lanterns and the first gray suggestion of dawn, is a sight that looks less like a work site and more like a small, frozen army assembling for a battle nobody else in the country knows is being fought. You're one of roughly 800 men who will work this lake during the 3-week window of this year's harvest. Around you, something like 1,800 horses are being led out onto the ice, not all at once, not all today, but enough that the animal traffic alone would make this look, to anyone watching from a distance, like the staging ground for a cavalry. This isn't a quaint little wintertime sideline for the local farmers, though it started that way decades ago. This is a factory. It just happens that the factory floor is a frozen lake, the raw material is winter itself, and the entire operation has to be finished completely before the thaw decides otherwise. You start the way everyone starts, clearing snow. A light snowfall is the lake's enemy in a way that might surprise you. It doesn't just sit there, it insulates, trapping warmth underneath it and slowing the freeze, and it has to come off before any cutting can begin. A horse drags a wide wooden scraper across the surface, clearing the loose stuff in long passes, and behind it comes a second scraper, this one fitted with steel blades, shaving away the ice's upper layer, the porous, snow-compacted crust that won't cut clean and won't store well. What's left underneath, once both passes are done, is what the harvesters actually want: dense, clear, merchant's ice, the kind that came straight from the lake's spring-fed water rather than from river ice contaminated with silt or worse, anything upstream that shouldn't be there. Now the marking begins. A man walks the cleared surface dragging a simple guide tool, really just a sharpened runner on a handle, scratching a single straight line across the ice to serve as a reference. Everything that follows keys off that first line. A horse-drawn cutter follows it, 2 parallel blades mounted a fixed distance apart, scoring a pair of shallow grooves about 2 inches deep into the surface. The horse turns, comes back, scores another pair, parallel to the first, the same distance apart again. Within an hour, what was a featureless white sheet has become a perfect grid, rectangles roughly 22 by 32 inches, repeating out across the entire lake in a checkerboard pattern that would not look out of place on a chessboard the size of a county. Then the real cutting starts, and this is where the work stops being about precision tools and starts being about brute, repetitive labor. An iron ice plow, heavier, more aggressive than the marking cutter, gets pulled by a team of horses straight down each scored groove, biting deeper this time, cutting to within about 4 inches of the bottom of the ice sheet. It does not cut all the way through. That last 4 inches is left deliberately intact, because a lake scored into floating chess pieces before you're ready to move them is a lake that's about to become extremely difficult to control. The final separation, popping each individual block free from its neighbors, is done by hand, with long-bladed saws, spuds, and fork bars, men walking the grid lines and cracking blocks loose section by section. Here's the part that should make your palms sweat a little even watching from a safe distance in your imagination. Once a large section breaks free, and these aren't small sections, they're floating rafts of ice the size of a house, men ride them. Standing on a slab of ice that's floating, detached on freezing water, pole in hand, using long ice hooks and poles to steer the raft like a barge toward the channel that's been cut leading to shore. If you slip, if the raft tips, if you misjudge the gap between two floating sections and your boot finds water instead of ice, the cold doesn't give you a grace period to think about your mistake. It's the kind of job where watch your step isn't a politeness, it's the entire safety briefing. The big floating rafts get subdivided into smaller, more manageable flows as they near shore, pushed and guided toward a conveyor, first a horse and rope system, and on the larger operations like this one, eventually a steam-powered chain elevator that does the heaviest lifting mechanically. From there, individual blocks ride the conveyor up out of the water and into the icehouse itself, which at an operation this size isn't really a building so much as a wooden hangar the size of several city blocks, perched as much as 70 feet above the lake's surface to take advantage of gravity on the way back down to the river. Inside, men stack the blocks layer by layer, leaving gaps that get packed tight with sawdust as the walls rise, building, floor by floor, an enormous frozen brick warehouse that will sit there, mostly undisturbed, until the heat of summer makes its contents valuable again. By the time the sun is fully up, you've been working for hours already, and you'll keep working until dark, because the entire harvest has to happen inside a window that nature controls, not you. Pay for this for the cold, the wet, the very real risk of a crushed limb or a fall through a thin patch, runs around $1 a day for ordinary laborers, with skilled mechanics pulling closer to $2. It's not nothing by the standards of the era. It's also not very much, given what you're risking to earn it. You might be a local farmer picking up seasonal cash during the only slow weeks of his agricultural year. Ice harvesting was famous for that, a winter crop that let men with no other income for 3 months suddenly have something to do and something to be paid for. You might be one of the area's many Irish or Italian immigrant laborers, for whom this kind of brutal, semi-skilled outdoor work was one of the few jobs reliably available. You might, by 1907, be a teenager named Josephine Hudson, who got hired onto this very workforce by cutting her hair short, dressing as a boy, and calling herself Joe, becoming, as far as anyone can document, the first woman to work the Knickerbocker Ice Company's harvest, in a trade that up until that point had been understood by everyone involved as exclusively men's work. What none of you are thinking about, probably, standing out here at 4 in the morning with your breath freezing in front of your face, is that the ice under your boots is going to end up cooling somebody's lemonade in a 5th-floor tenement walk-up on the Lower East Side sometime in July, 4 months and 25 miles from now, after a journey involving a gravity railway, a flat-bottomed barge, the entire length of the Hudson River, a horse-drawn delivery wagon, and a pair of iron tongs. You're thinking about your hands. Your hands are very cold, and there are still about 1,100 more tons of ice to cut before lunch. The job with 6 ways to die. Let's be honest about what we just watched, because the previous chapter described the ice harvest the way a company brochure would have described it, and the reality was considerably less tidy. Ice harvesting doesn't show up on many lists of history's most dangerous jobs, mostly because it's been forgotten entirely, rather than romanticized the way mining or logging sometimes get romanticized. But run down the actual hazard list, and it reads like a workplace safety inspector's worst week. You're standing on a surface that can fail without warning, over water cold enough to kill you in minutes through hypothermia alone, doing physically demanding labor with heavy iron tools, surrounded by horses that weigh half a ton each and have their own ideas about where they'd like to walk, in temperatures that make your hands clumsy exactly when you need them most precise. Start with the most obvious one, falling through. Ice that's been scored into a grid and partially cut is, by design, weaker than it was before you started working on it. You've sliced most of the way through in 100 places, leaving only a thin connecting layer holding the whole sheet together until you're ready to break it apart. A misjudged step near one of those cut lines, a patch where the ice ran thinner than expected, a horse putting its full weight in the wrong spot. Any of these could open a gap straight down into freezing water, with nothing waiting for you on the other side but a current and the clock. Contemporary accounts of the trade describe accidents involving both men and horses going through the ice as simply unremarkable, a known cost of doing business rather than a shocking exception. Historical accounts of Hudson Valley ice harvesting note that the work was, in their words, wet, cold, and hazardous, and that accidents, crushed limbs from heavy blocks, men and horses both occasionally lost beneath the surface, were a regular feature of the season, not a rare horror story. Then there's the simpler, dumber, more constant danger, the ice itself as cargo. A 2-foot block of dense lake ice weighs in the neighborhood of 200 pounds. Moving thousands of these by hand, with iron tongs and hooks, day after day, 12-hour shifts in the warmer months when ice was being shipped out rather than harvested in. This is repetitive, heavy, unforgiving labor, and the obvious failure mode is exactly what you'd expect. A block slips. A hand or a foot is in the wrong place. The historical record doesn't bother itemizing every crushed finger and broken toe, because there were simply too many of them to count individually. They were the background noise of the job, not the headline. Frostbite and hypothermia were the slower, quieter dangers, less dramatic than a man going through the ice, but probably more common, in the way that chronic damage usually outpaces acute disaster in any dangerous trade. You're standing on ice near open water in temperatures well below freezing for 10 or 12 hours a day, often soaked from spray or meltwater for 3 solid weeks. Wet wool gloves don't insulate. Wet boots don't insulate. The men doing this work were, by the nature of the job, constantly courting the kind of cold injury that, in a bad enough case, costs you fingers, toes, or worse. And then, almost perversely, there was fire. the one risk you would not expect from an industry built entirely around making things cold. The same sawdust insulation that made ice houses work, packed floor to ceiling between double wooden walls, was also a structure built almost entirely out of kindling. Dry wood and dry sawdust, stacked in massive quantities inside a wooden building the size of a city block, is not a fire-resistant combination. It's closer to the opposite, a structure that, once it catches, burns with terrifying speed and almost no way to stop it. Rockland Lake's own ice houses bore this out in the most ironic way imaginable. When the Knickerbocker Ice Company finally shut down its harvesting operation in 1924, and crews moved in 2 years later to demolish the remaining ice houses, the sawdust insulation that had spent nearly a century keeping the company's product frozen caught fire during the teardown and burned with such ferocity that it consumed almost the entire surrounding village. A building engineered with real ingenuity to defeat heat for 100 years went up like a torch in an afternoon, the moment anyone gave it the chance. There's a darker symmetry buried in that detail if you want to sit with it for a second. The single largest catastrophic loss connected to this entire industry, bigger than any individual drowning, bigger than any single season's frostbite count, wasn't caused by the cold at all. It was caused by exactly the material that had made the cold profitable in the first place. None of this, notably, was enough to keep the jobs from filling up every single winter. Part of that is simple economics. For farmers in Rockland County, the ice harvest fell during the only stretch of the year when their land wasn't producing income, and a few weeks of brutal, dangerous labor for cash money was, for many of them, a better deal than 3 months of doing nothing. Part of it is that the trade, almost uniquely for its time and place, didn't sort workers along the lines you'd expect. Hudson Valley ice harvesting crews are documented as having included white farmers, black laborers, and waves of Irish and Italian immigrants working side by side, not because anyone running the operation had progressive politics, but because the job was hard enough and the labor pool tight enough during the harvest window that companies simply needed bodies and weren't especially choosy about whose. That tight labor market cut both ways, though, and it didn't always favor the companies. In 1875, roughly 500 ice workers in Catskill, New York, described by one contemporary account as tough and determined, turned out in what amounted to a labor action, a sign that even in an industry without formal unions, workers understood they had leverage during the narrow window when ice absolutely had to be cut or the whole season's revenue was lost. Decades later, in 1911, the Knickerbocker Ice Company found itself in a strange standoff that exposed exactly how thin the company's margin for error really was. Investigators sent to Rockland Lake found ice houses sitting completely full of cut ice, with no one left to load it onto the barges bound for New York, because the company's president had been paying his workers $2 a day at a moment when smaller, independent ice operations nearby were offering double that. The workers simply walked, and the ice, fully harvested, perfectly good, completely useless sitting in a warehouse with nobody to move it, sat there as a monument to what happens when you try to run a seasonal monopoly on the cheap. By the time Knickerbocker's operation reached its full industrial scale, 3,000 employees at its peak, by some counts, running dozens of steamboats and 75 ice barges across the Hudson, the company had in effect built one of the largest seasonal labor forces in the entire region, assembled and disassembled every single year on the schedule set not by management, but by the weather. And here's the strange part, the part that should sit slightly uncomfortably with you. For all the danger, all the cold, all the crushed limbs and the men who didn't make it home, this entire brutal, dangerous 3-week annual scramble existed purely because there was, quite literally, no other way to do it. There was no machine that could manufacture ice at this scale, not yet, not at a price anyone could afford. If New York City wanted to keep its milk from spoiling, its meat from rotting, its beer cold enough to drink, the only available technology on Earth, full stop, was several hundred men standing on a lake in the dark, doing this exact job, exactly this dangerously, every single winter for decades. That's the trade-off nobody in the city actually had to think about. You got your ice delivered to your door by a man in a wagon, clean and quiet and entirely disconnected from where it came from. Somebody else had already taken the risk on your behalf, 25 miles upriver, months earlier, standing on the frozen lake at 4 in the morning so that your butter wouldn't go rancid in August. It's worth holding onto that image because it's about to scale up from a single lake with 800 workers into an entire industrial corridor stretching the length of the Hudson River, organized around feeding a city that, by the back half of the 19th century, had become genuinely, almost frighteningly dependent on a substance it could only get for about 3 weeks a year. The mountain of ice above the Hudson, if you wanted to understand, in one image, just how thoroughly New York City had outsourced its survival to a frozen lake it couldn't see from the street, you'd want to look at Rockland Lake. It sits about 25 miles north of Manhattan, on the western side of the Hudson, perched up above the river atop a ridge the Palisades form as they curve west near the village of Haverstraw. It's spring-fed, which mattered enormously. Spring water freezes cleaner and clearer than river water, with none of the silt, sediment, or contamination that came from a moving waterway draining who knows what from upstream. Word of that purity traveled fast. By 1836, the Astor House, one of the city's grandest hotels, was advertising Rockland Lake ice by name on its menus, the way a modern restaurant might brag about sourcing from a specific farm. In an era before brand loyalty was really a concept anyone had articulated, Rockland Lake ice had become exactly that, a name people asked for. The ice trade at Rockland Lake actually predates Wyeth's Plow slightly. Local operations had been cutting ice there commercially since around 1831, but it was the combination of clean water, mechanized harvesting, and a genuinely brilliant piece of logistics engineering that turned it from a regional supplier into what locals eventually nicknamed, with a mix of pride and dark humor, the Ice House of New York City. The bottleneck nobody could ignore was geography. Rockland Lake sits on top of a ridge. The Hudson River, where barges could actually pick up cargo, sits at the bottom of that ridge, several hundred feet below and a significant horizontal distance away. Hauling tons of ice down a hill by horse and cart every single day, all summer, was the kind of inefficiency that ate directly into profit margins. So in 1858, the operation built something genuinely clever, a gravity-fed railway, an ice train, that ran down the slope from the lake's ice houses to a chute leading to the riverbank. Workers loaded ice onto cars at the top. Gravity did most of the work getting it down. A stationary engine at the bottom helped manage the empty cars coming back up for another load. It wasn't romantic engineering, There was nothing here that would have impressed a 19th century World's Fair, but it solved exactly the problem it needed to solve, fast and cheap, using a hillside that was already there for free. In 1855, 3 competing ice operations around the lake, having spent years fighting each other, and at points fighting in actual courtrooms over who held harvesting rights to which section of the lake. A dispute eventually settled by the courts simply declaring the lake itself public property, which everyone could harvest but no one could own outright, decided that consolidation beat competition and merged into a single firm, the Knickerbocker Ice Company. The name would go on to become so recognizable that, decades later, a Norwegian ice exporter apparently borrowed it outright, on the theory that Knickerbocker carried more brand weight in the global ice trade than whatever they'd been calling themselves. Knickerbocker did not stay small. The company built ice houses along Rockland Lake's shore capable of storing more than 100,000 tons of ice at a single time, structures so large that when Thomas Edison's film crew showed up in 1902 to document the operation, yes, there is footage. The early film industry found ice harvesting visually interesting enough to point a camera at it. The 3 ice houses captured on film alone held close to that 100,000-ton figure between them. At its peak, the company owned a dozen steamboats and 75 ice barges, and employed somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 people across the full harvesting and shipping operation, making it, by a wide margin, one of the largest single employers in the entire Hudson Valley. Here's the number that should actually stop you for a second. By the 1880s, New York City was consuming roughly 1.5 million tons of ice annually. Not a typo. 1.5 million tons every single year for a city that had bought a comparatively modest 75,000 tons total back in 1855. That's a 20-fold increase in roughly 3 decades, a growth curve that tracks almost exactly with the city's own explosive population growth, its rising density, and the simple fact that the more crowded and industrialized New York became, the more completely it depended on a continuous supply of frozen water to keep its food supply from actively poisoning people. To meet a demand curve like that, Rockland Lake couldn't do it alone, even at its considerable scale, and it didn't have to. By the late 19th century, something like 135 separate ice houses had been built up and down the Hudson, stretching from the area around New York City all the way north to Albany, each one tapping local ponds, lakes, or river ice during the harvest window, and then holding that inventory through the warmer months. The Hudson Valley, almost overnight, had become the single largest natural ice producing region in the country, an entire regional economy built around a product that existed for exactly 3 weeks a year and then had to be carefully, expensively preserved for the other 49. The transport logistics, once the ice was harvested and stored, ran on a deceptively simple principle: weight. Ice fetched its highest prices in summer, when demand peaked and the supply already in the ground had to last until the next freeze. So operations held their inventory through spring and shipped it south on flat-hulled barges, specifically designed to sit low in the water, a hull shape that let more of the river's naturally cold water surround and insulate the cargo during the trip downstream. A summer crew at Rockland Lake, somewhere around 80 workers, putting in 12-hour days, handled the job of moving ice out of storage and onto these barges, loading roughly 2,000 tons onto a single boat per day, a pace that multiplied across an entire shipping season, accounts for a meaningful fraction of that 1.5 million ton annual appetite all by itself. Once it reached Manhattan, the ice didn't go straight into people's homes. The Knickerbocker Ice Company maintained its own network of storage facilities scattered across the city, documented locations on West 43rd Street, West 20th Street, Bank Street, Canal Street, Delancey Street, East 33rd Street, 92nd Street, and East 128th Street, a footprint that put company-owned cold storage within reach of nearly every neighborhood in the borough. From these depots, the ice fanned out to its final destination through a fleet of delivery wagons. By the 1880s, roughly 1,500 of them rattling through the city's streets, Knickerbocker's signature bright yellow wagons among the most recognizable. A single wagon and its driver might deliver as much as 80 tons of ice a week, block by block, tongs in hand, hauled up narrow tenement staircases to apartments where a wooden icebox sat waiting, and where the difference between getting that delivery and not getting it could, in the wrong summer, be the difference between a child's milk staying safe to drink and not. This was the system in full, a lake you'd never heard of, 25 miles from the city, feeding a network of barges, trains, storage depots, and horse-drawn wagons so extensive and so routine that most New Yorkers gave it roughly the same amount of conscious thought they gave to where their tap water came from. It just arrived. The Iceman came by. You paid him. Your food didn't spoil. The thousands of dangerous, cold, exhausting man-hours that had to happen upstream of that simple daily transaction, the harvest, the storage, the barge trip, the wagon route, were, by design, completely invisible to the person standing on the stoop handing over a dime. That invisibility is exactly what makes the next part of the story land as hard as it does. Because an entire city had quietly made itself completely dependent on this one supply chain, on this lake, this harvest, this network of barges and wagons, without ever really stopping to ask what would happen if someone figured out how to control it. Someone eventually did, and when he did, the dime in the Iceman's hand stopped being a small, forgettable transaction and started being, for thousands of the city's poorest families, a genuine matter of life and death. But before we get to the man who turned New York's ice supply into a weapon, it's worth spending a little time on what all that ice was actually for, because the dependency wasn't abstract, and it wasn't just about keeping a glass of lemonade cold. The arrival of cheap, reliable ice quietly rewired what an American city could eat, how it could eat it, and how many of its children survived long enough to grow up. The Iceman Cometh walk into a New York tenement kitchen in, say, 1885, and the single most important piece of furniture in the room, more important than the stove, arguably more important than the bed, is a wooden box standing somewhere near the wall, lined with tin or zinc, with a hinged door on top and a drain at the bottom. This is the icebox. It is, in every meaningful sense, the ancestor of your refrigerator, and it is also, structurally, an extremely simple machine with exactly one moving part: gravity, pulling cold air down from a melting block of ice at the top, through the cabinet, and out a drain at the bottom, taking the heat of the food with it on the way out. It worked, but it worked on borrowed time, ticking down with every degree the room warmed, and every hour the ice sat there doing its slow, dripping job. Which meant the entire system depended completely on a recurring transaction that had become as routine as the mail, the Iceman's daily round. Here's how the household side of it actually functioned, and it's worth walking through because the mechanics reveal something real about how dependent ordinary life had become on this supply chain. Families would post a card in their front window, visible from the street, indicating how much ice they wanted that day: 25 pounds, 50, 75, 100. A little piece of household signage whose entire purpose was to save the Iceman the trouble of knocking. He'd see the card, judge the size of block needed, sling it onto his shoulder or grip it with a pair of iron tongs, and haul it, often up several flights of narrow tenement stairs, to the apartment, where it went straight into the top of the icebox to begin its slow, useful, doomed melt. This wasn't an occasional luxury purchase. By the 1880s, something like 1,500 ice delivery wagons were working New York streets on a regular basis, which tells you everything you need to know about how thoroughly this had become baseline infrastructure rather than an indulgence. And the Iceman himself had, by this point, become enough of a fixture in American daily life that he shows up as a recognizable character type in the folklore and vaudeville humor of the era. The trope of the Iceman as a vaguely roguish figure who got more attention than he should have from housewives left alone during the workday wasn't subtle, and it wasn't really about ice at all. It was a joke about a man who had legitimate, expected daily access to people's homes, in an era when that kind of routine intimacy between strangers and households was otherwise rare. The joke only worked because the Iceman's visit was that reliable, that embedded in the rhythm of ordinary domestic life. Kids had their own relationship with the ice wagon, and it had nothing to do with food preservation. In the brutal heat of a New York summer, with no air conditioning and precious little relief of any kind, ice wagons making their delivery rounds would frequently be trailed by children hoping for a dropped chip or a sliver knocked loose in the unloading, small free shards of relief from the heat, sucked on like a treat, gone in minutes. It's a small detail, but it tells you something about how scarce and how valued a simple piece of cold actually was, for a population with essentially no other way to cool down. Now scale that household-level dependency up to the level of an entire urban food system, because that's really where the ice trade's deepest impact lived. Before reliable, affordable ice, American food preservation ran on a fairly grim menu of options: salting, drying, smoking, pickling, canning methods that all worked after a fashion, but that universally sacrificed freshness for shelf life. Salted meat doesn't taste like fresh meat. Dried fish doesn't taste like fresh fish. None of these techniques let a fish market sell something that tasted like it had been caught yesterday, because none of them were designed to preserve yesterday. They were designed to preserve edible, eventually, somehow. Ice changed the calculation entirely, because cold doesn't alter the food the way salt or smoke does. It just slows down the clock. A piece of meat kept on ice tastes mostly like a piece of meat, which sounds like a low bar until you remember that it was, for most of human history, not an available option at urban scale. Butchers could now hold fresh meat for days rather than hours. Fishmongers could sell something resembling the actual catch rather than something cured beyond recognition. Dairy, and this is the piece of the puzzle that mattered most, in terms of actual human survival, could be kept from turning for long enough to reach a family's table in a condition that wouldn't make a child sick. That last point is not a minor detail, and it's worth being blunt about it. In an era before pasteurization was standard practice, spoiled milk was a genuine, documented killer of infants and small children, particularly in the crowded tenement districts where families had no good way to keep anything cold on their own. An ice supply that worked reliably, that arrived every day without fail, that kept a family's milk safe through a brutal August. This wasn't a quality of life upgrade. For the city's poorest households, with the least margin for error, it was closer to a basic public health requirement, on the same tier as clean drinking water. We're going to come back to exactly how literally true that statement was, because it's about to become the central fact of one of the ugliest scandals in New York's political history. For now, just sit with the fact that the Iceman didn't come today, and my baby is sick were, for a meaningful number of families, directly and causally connected. Ice didn't just preserve food at the point of sale, either. It transformed how far food could travel before it reached the point of sale at all, and that transformation rippled out into entirely new industries. The most consequential example sits 1,000 miles west in Chicago, where the cattle industry had a logistics problem. It was far more efficient to slaughter cattle near the stockyards and ship the dressed meat east, rather than shipping live, weight-losing, stressed animals the whole distance by rail. The obstacle was simple: meat without refrigeration spoiled long before it reached an eastern market, full stop. Early experiments were clumsy. Meatpacker Gustavus Swift tried, in the 1850s, simply pulling the doors off a string of boxcars and letting the winter air do the cooling, a method that worked, sort of, for exactly as long as the weather cooperated, which in practice meant it barely worked at all. A patented 1867 design tried packing ice and salt directly against cuts of meat hung on interior racks, which solved the temperature problem and immediately created a new one. Meat resting directly against ice discolored and picked up off flavors, and the hanging racks had an unfortunate tendency to swing on curves and occasionally derail the entire car. It took until 1878, when Swift brought in an engineer named Andrew Chase, for the design to finally click into something workable. Ice bunkers built into either end of the car, walled off from the cargo space, with airflow doing the cooling rather than direct contact. Cold air moved through the car. The meat itself never touched a single block of ice. That single design change, moving the ice from directly on the food to in a separate bunker, cooling the air around the food, is, in miniature, the entire conceptual leap that made an entire industry possible. Within a year of Chase's refined design entering service, Swift was shipping an average of 3,000 carcasses a week east by rail, a volume that simply could not have existed under the old constraints. Competitors like Armour followed almost immediately. By the 1920s, the Swift refrigerator line alone had grown to more than 7,000 specialized cars, instantly recognizable by their painted livery rolling across the country. A network so extensive that, at its peak, somewhere between 800 and 1,200 of these reefers were in transit across the United States on any given day, carrying meat, dairy, and produce to markets that, a generation earlier, had no reliable way to get any of it fresh. None of that rail network would have meant anything for New York specifically without the ice itself, the literal physical ice loaded into those bunkers, periodically replenished at icing stations along the route, sourced from exactly the same pond, and like harvesting operations we've already spent 4 chapters inside. Rockland Lake's ice wasn't just chilling lemonade on someone's stoop. By extension, through this network of ice houses, barges and refrigerated rail cars. It was part of the system keeping Chicago beef edible by the time it reached a Manhattan butcher's counter. And then there's beer, which deserves its own brief moment of recognition, because the rise of one of America's most enduring drinking habits is, almost entirely, a refrigeration story nobody tells that way. Lager beer, the clean, crisp style that German immigrant brewers brought to American cities throughout the 19th century, and the style that would go on to utterly dominate American beer drinking for the next century and a half, requires cold fermentation and cold storage to produce properly. Ale, the older English-style tradition, ferments warm and tolerates inconsistent temperatures reasonably well. Lager does not. It needs sustained cold for weeks to develop correctly. Without a reliable ice supply, brewing lager at any real commercial scale in a place like New York simply wasn't viable. With one, it absolutely was, and by 1879, more than 120 breweries were operating across Manhattan and Brooklyn combined, a brewing boom that tracks the ice trade's expansion almost exactly. Every glass of cold lager served in a New York saloon in the Gilded Age owed a quiet, unacknowledged debt to a frozen lake upstate and the men who'd cut it apart in January. Ice cream, oysters on shaved ice, soda fountains as a genuine social destination rather than just a drugstore counter. The whole landscape of late Victorian urban leisure that involved anything cold was, without exception, downstream of this same supply chain. None of it required anyone in the city to think about Rockland Lake, or the Gravity Railway, or the 80 men loading barges 12 hours a day through a brutal summer. That invisibility was the whole point of a well-functioning supply chain. It worked precisely because nobody had to think about it, which is exactly what made it so dangerous the moment somebody figured out how to break it on purpose. 10 days that nearly killed New York on August 4, 1896, the temperature in New York City climbed past 90 degrees and simply stayed there. It would not meaningfully drop, day or night, for 10 straight days. You need to understand what that actually meant for the people living through it, because heat wave undersells it badly. The official thermometers measured at street level, sometimes with a slight breeze available, read in the high 80s and low 90s. Inside the brick tenement blocks of the Lower East Side, where as many as 100,000 people were packed into housing never designed for anything like that density, with no cross ventilation, no running water in most units, and 5 or 6 people sharing a single room, the actual temperature climbed far higher. Contemporary accounts describe interior conditions reaching 120 degrees. At night, the outdoor temperature didn't drop below 70, and on 3 consecutive nights it stayed above 80, meaning there was no relief anywhere at any hour for 10 consecutive days. Humidity sat near 90% the entire time. There was, by multiple accounts, no wind at all. People started dying almost immediately, and the dying didn't stop until the heat finally broke. The youngest and oldest went first, the way they almost always do in a heat crisis. But this heat wave's particular cruelty was how hard it fell on a third group nobody usually thinks of as vulnerable. Healthy young working men, in their 20s, doing physical labor outdoors because a 6-day, 60-hour workweek didn't pause for weather. A 45-year-old silver molder named John Singer, living in a Lower East Side tenement, was struck down by heat stroke on August 11 and died within 24 hours. His death certificate listed summer heat as a contributing cause, the era's clinical way of admitting that the temperature itself had killed a man going about an ordinary workday. He was one of hundreds with stories essentially identical to his. The conditions inside the tenements pushed people toward increasingly desperate, increasingly dangerous ways of finding relief. Families climbed out onto rooftops to sleep, hoping for even a slight breath of moving air at altitude. Children slept on fire escapes. And because exhaustion, heat-induced disorientation, and occasionally alcohol were all working against people's balance and judgment at exactly the moment they were perched several stories above a courtyard, the predictable happened repeatedly. People rolled off rooftops in their sleep and fell to their deaths. Children fell from fire escapes and broke limbs, or worse. Some people seeking any relief at all made their way down to the piers along the East River to sleep in the open air near the water, and some of those people rolled into the river and drowned, never waking up to know it was happening. The city's official response for most of the crisis was close to non-existent. The mayor did not call an emergency meeting of his department heads until the heat wave's final day, by which point it had already run its course and was about to break on its own. A handful of individual department heads acted on their own initiative rather than waiting for direction from above. The Commissioner of Public Works shifted outdoor laborers' hours to avoid the worst of the midday sun and ordered city streets hosed down, both to cool the pavement and to wash away the accumulating filth that the heat was making worse. The Parks Department, recognizing that people climbing onto rooftops and falling to their deaths was a problem the city's own overnight sleeping ban in public parks had inadvertently made worse, finally suspended that ban and let people sleep outdoors in green space instead. A small, late, obviously correct policy reversal that almost certainly saved lives it should have been saving from day one. And then there was ice, which is the part of this story that connects most directly back to everything we've spent 6 chapters building toward. Ice in 1896 wasn't a comfort item in this crisis. It was closer to a medical necessity, and the city's poorest residents were, in the middle of a multi-year economic depression with widespread unemployment, often unable to afford it at exactly the moment they needed it most. A young police commissioner, 37 years old, several political offices away from anything resembling the national stage he'd eventually occupy, looked at this gap and made a decision that, in hindsight, reads as a small but genuinely consequential act of public health intervention. His name was Theodore Roosevelt, and the idea he championed was straightforward: have the city purchase and give away free ice to its poorest residents, distributed directly out of police station houses, bypassing the normal commercial supply chain entirely. It worked, as far as these things can be measured. Roosevelt personally oversaw the distribution, and in the aftermath, he did something that very few officials of his era bothered to do. He walked the back alleys of the city's worst tenement districts to actually see how the ice was being used, rather than simply checking a box and moving on. What he found stayed with him. He watched immigrant fathers chip pieces off the blocks his department had distributed and hand them to their children to suck on. A small, desperate mercy against heat that had no other remedy available to them. He would later write about the experience in terms that read as genuinely affected rather than performatively sympathetic, recalling, in his own words, the gasping misery of small children and exhausted mothers. an image that historians studying his political development have connected directly to the progressive, reform-minded instincts he carried into the rest of his career, first as governor of New York and eventually as president. By the time the heat finally broke on the morning of August 13, a light breeze arriving at last, building through the day, bringing the first real relief in 10 days, the death toll across the city stood at a number historians still debate the precision of, but that virtually every serious account places somewhere between 1,300 and 1,500 people. To put that in perspective with numbers that actually mean something to most people, the death toll from this single 10-day heat event in New York City exceeded the combined deaths from the 1863 New York City draft riots and the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, a weather event, 10 days. More dead than two of the most infamous urban disasters in 19th century American history, combined and largely forgotten, in the way that disasters which primarily kill poor and working-class people so often are, while disasters with more dramatic visuals or more politically connected victims get remembered. There's a detail buried in the history of this same year, 1896, that deserves to sit right alongside the heat wave story rather than waiting for its own separate chapter, because the timing isn't a coincidence so much as a quiet, ugly preview of what was coming. That same year, the major ice companies serving New York City, Knickerbocker among them, began consolidating into a single combined entity, a natural trust formed explicitly to coordinate pricing and supply across what had previously been a more fragmented, more competitive market. At the moment Theodore Roosevelt was distributing free ice out of police stations to keep tenement children alive, the commercial infrastructure that controlled the city's entire ice supply was already, separately, quietly reorganizing itself into something with far less interest in keeping prices low for exactly those families. Nobody connected those two facts at the time, because there was no reason yet to think they were connected. The consolidation hadn't done anything dramatic. Prices hadn't spiked. It looked, to the extent anyone outside the industry was paying attention at all, like an unremarkable bit of corporate consolidation, the kind of thing that happened constantly across dozens of industries in the trust building, monopoly-forming decades of the late 19th century, barely worth a second look from a city that had just survived 10 of the deadliest days in its history and had bigger things on its mind. It would take 4 more years for that consolidation to become a household name, and when it did, it would do so not through some slow accumulation of public attention, but through a single, deliberate decision by one man, a decision made in the comfortable confidence that the same poor families who'd nearly died for lack of ice in 1896 had no real choice but to pay whatever he decided to charge them for it. The trust Charles Wyman Morse was born in Bath, Maine, in 1856, the son of a man who ran a towing business on the Kennebec River, a river that happened to be one of the major ice harvesting waterways feeding the entire eastern seaboard. Morse grew up, in other words, inside the ice trade rather than discovering it as an outside opportunity, and by the time he was a young man, he understood the business from the inside in a way that gave him a real advantage over anyone trying to compete with him later. He earned the nickname Ice King early in his career, and by most accounts, he earned it the same way you earn most nicknames in business history that come with a crown attached, not through innovation, but through ruthless, patient consolidation. Morse's method was simple to describe and brutal to live through if you were a competitor. Buy up the smaller, independent ice companies one at a time, folding them into a single combined operation until you controlled enough of the supply that customers no longer had meaningful alternatives. By the time he'd finished organizing his holdings under a structure he called the Ice Securities Company, and eventually the American Ice Company, Morse controlled the overwhelming majority of the natural ice supplying New York City, a market that, as we've established, the city's entire population had quietly come to depend on for food safety, not just comfort. But Morse understood something that pure market consolidation alone couldn't give him. Even with most of his competitors bought out, the New York waterfront still had a few independent docks where a rival's ice could theoretically come ashore. To close that gap completely, to make his monopoly not just dominant but absolute, he needed the city government on his side. And the city government, in 1898, had just elected its first mayor under the newly consolidated five-borough structure, a man named Robert Anderson Van Wyck. Van Wyck was, by most contemporary descriptions, a fairly unremarkable, colorless figure, a former judge handpicked by Tammany Hall's machine precisely because he seemed like the kind of man who'd let the organization run the city without much personal interference. He'd had a few genuine accomplishments in his first 2 years in office, including the early push toward the city's first subway system. None of that would end up mattering because Van Wyck's name was about to become permanently and inseparably attached to one specific scandal. The arrangement Morse built with Tammany Hall was almost crude in its simplicity. He gave, or in some accounts, sold at a steeply discounted price. With financing, he personally arranged substantial blocks of stock in his ice company to both Van Wyck and to Richard Croker, the actual head of Tammany Hall's political machine. In exchange, Tammany's control over the city's waterfront and dock workers ensured that, by 1900, no ice could legally be unloaded at New York's piers unless it belonged to Morse's American Ice Company, carried on Morse's own ships and barges. It was the kind of arrangement that didn't require anyone to write down an explicit quid pro quo, because everyone involved understood exactly what was being traded for what. In April 1900, in a gesture that, in retrospect, reads as either supreme confidence or supreme carelessness, Mayor Van Wyck accepted Morse's invitation to be a personal guest at Morse's home in Bath, Maine. The two men toured Morse's ice operations on the Kennebec together, declining to speak with local reporters who noticed the visit. Nobody recorded exactly what was discussed during that trip. What's clear is that when Van Wyck returned to New York, events moved quickly. The following month, in May 1900, during what was, by every account, a perfectly normal, even abundant ice harvest the previous winter, with no actual supply shortage anywhere in the system, the American Ice Company announced it was doubling its prices. Large commercial buyers who'd been paying roughly 15 cents per 100 pounds saw that climb to around 25 cents. Household customers, the people buying small quantities for their own ice boxes, the exact population that had nearly died for lack of affordable ice 4 years earlier, had been paying about 25 cents per 100 pounds and now found themselves facing prices as high as 60 cents. Read that pricing structure carefully because it's not incidental. The people buying the least ice in the smallest, most desperate quantities were the ones hit with the largest percentage increase. On top of the price hike, the company simultaneously announced it would reduce household deliveries from daily service down to 3 times a week, and would stop selling the smallest 5-cent and 10-cent portions altogether, a portion size that had been, for many of the city's poorest families, the only quantity they could ever actually afford. Do the arithmetic on what that combination of changes actually meant for a tenement family in the middle of a New York summer. Fewer deliveries. No small portions. Prices more than doubled at the exact moment your household budget had the least room to absorb a shock. An icebox that simply could not hold enough ice, even at full capacity, to bridge the gap between deliveries that had just gotten less frequent. This wasn't a price increase in the way we'd normally think about one, a business adjusting to costs or demand. This was a company, having already secured a legal monopoly over the physical infrastructure required to get ice into the city at all, simply deciding to extract as much money as the market would bear from a population with zero alternative, and a genuine, documented history of dying without the product in question. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Newspapers, the New York World prominent among them, began digging, and what they found was damning enough to read like fiction. American Ice, they reported, held an effective monopoly over which companies could legally land ice at the city's piers, meaning the May price increase wasn't a response to market conditions at all. It was simply what a company with no competition decided it could get away with charging. And buried in the company's official stockholder records, made public that June, was a name that turned a business story into a political detonation. Robert A. Van Wyck, mayor of New York City, holding 2,660 shares of preferred stock and 3,325 shares of common stock, a position later estimated at roughly $680,000 in value, against a mayoral salary of just $15,000 a year. He had not, by most accounts, paid for the shares himself. Morse had reportedly helped finance the purchase and arranged a favorable price, the financial equivalent of simply handing the mayor a stake in the company whose monopoly he was, in his official capacity, in a position to protect. He wasn't alone. Richard Croker, Tammany's actual boss, had his own substantial stake. So did John F. Carroll, an influential Tammany figure with ties to the city's waterfront administration, the exact office that controlled which companies got dock access in the first place. Frank Pratt, son of a prominent Republican state party boss, was on the list too, a detail contemporary reporting seized on as proof that the corruption, at least in this instance, had crossed party lines with the easy bipartisanship that money tends to enable. The cartoon image that crystallized the public mood, published on the cover of Puck magazine that year, showed Mayor Van Wyck drowning in the American Ice Company scandal, while Tammany Hall dangled a lifeline just out of reach, offering rescue on its own terms. Van Wyck's defense, delivered before Justice William J. Gaynor in the resulting investigation, amounted to a claim of naivety that strained credibility even by the generous standards of turn-of-the-century municipal corruption hearings. He testified that he'd bought the stock himself, that it wasn't a gift, that as mayor he simply came into contact with influential men, and that one of those men, Morse, had persuaded him to invest, the way any businessman might persuade any other businessman. He acknowledged borrowing money to make the purchase, but insisted he wasn't beholden to anyone over it. Yes, he admitted, he had visited Morse's home in Maine and toured his ice factories, but he framed it as something close to an accident, a side trip tacked onto an unrelated upstate journey because Morse mentioned he hadn't seen his own children in 9 months and asked if the mayor would care to come along. It is, on its face, an explanation that asks you to believe an enormous amount of coincidence happened to align in exactly the configuration that benefited a price-gouging monopoly. Governor Theodore Roosevelt, the same Roosevelt who'd handed out free ice from police stations 4 years earlier, now several rungs further up the political ladder, initiated a separate state-level investigation into the affair. That inquiry concluded that Van Wyck had not been personally, criminally implicated in orchestrating the scheme. It is worth noting that this verdict, while probably accurate on the narrow question of criminal conspiracy, did very little to change the much broader public perception of what had actually happened. That the mayor of New York City had taken an enormous, favorably financed stake in a monopoly that subsequently used its market power, secured in part through the mayor's own office, to double the price of a literal life-saving commodity for the city's poorest residents. Under the glare of public outrage, congressional attention, and the threat of formal antitrust proceedings, Morse did what cornered monopolists in this era generally did when the heat got too intense. He folded the operation, dropped the prices back down, and dissolved the structure of the trust before prosecutors could build a case sturdy enough to make charges stick. He walked away from the entire affair having pocketed an estimated $12 million in profit from the maneuver, a fortune that, adjusted for what it could buy at the time, represented one of the more spectacular financial windfalls extracted from a single, brazen act of price manipulation in the era's history. The political fallout, unlike the legal fallout, stuck. Tammany Hall's machine, which had survived plenty of scandals over the decades through sheer organizational discipline, took a real hit from this one, partly because the victims were so clearly, sympathetically, the machine's own supposed base. Poor and working-class immigrant families, exactly the population Tammany claimed to represent and protect in exchange for their votes, discovering that their own mayor had profited personally from a scheme that made keeping their children's milk safe measurably more expensive. The New York Times, looking back at the Van Wyck administration a couple of years later, summed up its character in a phrase that's stuck in the historical record ever since: an administration mired in black ooze and slime. In the 1901 mayoral election, Tammany's hand-picked candidate lost to a fusion reform ticket led by Seth Low, in a defeat widely attributed, by contemporaries and historians alike, directly to the lingering stench of the Ice Trust affair. Van Wyck himself landed, by any reasonable financial measure, on his feet. The day after leaving office, he married and immediately relocated to Paris, telling friends and political enemies alike that he had no intention of ever returning to New York. He hadn't been a wealthy man before becoming mayor. He left office with something in the neighborhood of $5 million sitting in a European bank account, a sum worth tens of millions in today's terms, and lived out the remainder of his life abroad, returning to the United States only once in 1918 in a casket for burial at Woodlawn Cemetery. Morse's own story didn't end with the Ice Trust either, though it did eventually end badly. Having walked away from the ice business with his $12 million intact, he plowed his fortune into shipping lines and an increasingly tangled web of bank ownership, eventually controlling or sitting on the board of more than a dozen banks across New York. That empire collapsed spectacularly in 1907, when Morse's attempt to corner the market on copper mining shares helped trigger the Panic of 1907, a financial crisis serious enough to topple the Knickerbocker Trust Company, an unrelated financial institution, despite the unfortunately familiar name, and send shockwaves through the entire national economy. Federal prosecutors, led by future Secretary of State Henry L. Stimson, eventually convicted Morse of misappropriating bank funds, and he was sentenced to 15 years in the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. He spent part of that sentence claiming, with the help of an extensive and well-organized public relations campaign run partly by his wife, that he was too gravely ill to survive imprisonment, a claim apparently persuasive enough that the city of Bath, Maine, formally petitioned President William Howard Taft for a pardon, a request signed by the sitting mayor, 6 former mayors, and a number of state legislators. Taft granted the pardon in 1912. Morse, by most accounts, made a fairly swift and complete recovery from his supposedly terminal illness almost immediately afterward, and went on to spend a chunk of World War I making yet another fortune through shipbuilding contracts that themselves eventually drew federal fraud allegations. It is, in other words, a story with almost no genuine accountability anywhere in it. A mayor who lost his political career but kept his millions and his freedom. A monopolist who briefly went to prison and then talked his way back out of it. And a city's poorest families who got their ice prices reduced back to something survivable eventually, but who never received so much as an acknowledgement that the scheme had, in any direct sense, cost any of them anything. There's a postscript worth noting, 11 years later, that suggests the lesson nobody learned the first time around hadn't been learned the second time either. In 1911, the Knickerbocker Ice Company, the original Rockland Lake operation, by now operating somewhat independently of Morse's earlier maneuvering, was again charged with monopoly behavior and profiteering, this time for raising prices during another summer heat wave. New York newspapers ran editorials against the company once more. The city's district attorney once again opened an investigation into whether the operation constituted an illegal monopoly. The details differed slightly. A labor dispute over wages tangled up in the mix this time, rather than a straightforward Tammany kickback scheme, but the basic shape of the story was unmistakably familiar. A company controlling a literal life or death commodity, deciding, during the exact season when demand and need both peaked simultaneously, that this was the moment to squeeze. By 1911, though, something had quietly shifted underneath this entire industry, something that, within little more than a decade, would make the whole question of who controlled the ice trust almost completely irrelevant. The natural ice business, for all its scandal and all its scale, had already started losing ground to a competitor nobody back at Rockland Lake had taken seriously enough, soon enough. Ice that didn't need a lake, a winter, or 800 men with saws at all. Ice that a machine could simply make, on demand, indoors, in any season, in any climate. And as it happened, the push toward that machine-made alternative hadn't come primarily from greedy industrialists looking to undercut Morse's monopoly. It had come decades earlier from a doctor in Florida who was just trying to keep his patients from dying of fever, and from a growing, increasingly well-founded fear that natural ice itself, the product everyone in this story has been racing to harvest, store, and deliver, might be quietly killing people in a way nobody had thought to look for. The poison question long before anyone in New York worried about a price-gouging monopoly. A doctor in a small Florida port town was already quietly convinced that the entire natural ice industry had a problem nobody wanted to talk about, and his solution to it would eventually outlast every lake, every ice house, and every fortune built on Rockland Lake's frozen surface. John Gorey arrived in Apalachicola, Florida, in 1833, a young physician treating patients through the region's brutal, recurring outbreaks of yellow fever. The medical consensus of the era, wrong as it happens, since nobody yet understood the disease was mosquito-borne, held that summer heat itself was the driving cause of these epidemics. Gorey, working from that flawed but sincere premise, became convinced that cooling his patients' rooms could ease their suffering and possibly even slow the disease's spread. The natural ice trade could, in theory, supply that cold. Tudor's and Wyeth's network had, by this point, made shipping northern ice to southern ports a routine commercial activity. But it was slow, it was seasonal. It was expensive by the time it reached a town like Apalachicola, and it depended entirely on a supply chain Gorey had no control over and no way to scale to the needs of an actual hospital ward. So, starting sometime in the late 1830s, Gorey set out to build a machine that could simply make ice on demand locally, without needing a frozen lake anywhere nearby. He worked largely alone, funding the research out of his own pocket, publishing pseudonymous articles advocating for the idea under the name Jenner in the local paper, a choice that suggests even Gorey understood how strange his ambition sounded to his neighbors. One contemporary editor's response to those articles captured the prevailing attitude perfectly. In an era when the natural ice trade was booming and seemed to be working just fine, the very notion that a person could manufacture ice artificially struck most people as bordering on blasphemous, an affront to the natural order rather than a reasonable engineering problem. Gorey kept at it anyway. By 1844, he'd given up his medical practice entirely to focus on the machine, and by 1848, he had a working prototype. A vapor compression refrigeration system, powerable by horse, water, wind, or sail, that compressed air and then allowed it to expand rapidly. A process that draws heat out of the surrounding environment as a byproduct of the physics involved. The same basic principle, broadly speaking, that still runs every refrigerator and air conditioner on Earth today. In May 1851, he received U.S. Patent number 8080 for what he called an improved process for the artificial production of ice, the first patent the United States government had ever issued for a mechanical ice-making device. It changed nothing for Gorey personally. His machine was, by the engineering standards of the day, bulky, inefficient, and difficult to operate reliably. He toured southern cities looking for investors to fund an actual manufacturing facility, and found none willing to bet on the technology. Worse, by some accounts, the established northern ice trade, recognizing a genuine existential threat to its entire business model when it saw one actively work to discredit Gorey in the press, treating his invention less like a curiosity and more like a competitive danger worth stamping out early. He died in 1855, largely broke, largely unrecognized, having proven a principle that the world wasn't yet ready to act on. The world got ready faster than anyone expected, And the thing that forced its hand wasn't innovation, it was war. When the Civil War cut off the Confederate South's access to the established coastal ice trade from New England southern cities that had spent decades depending entirely on shipped northern ice, suddenly had no alternative supply at all. That crisis created exactly the kind of urgent, captive market that Gorey's struggling invention had never quite managed to find on its own. European inventors, building on Gorey's groundwork and on parallel research by figures like Ferdinand Carré in France, refined the mechanical approach into something more compact and commercially practical. And artificial ice plants, bulky, fuel-hungry, expensive to build, but finally functional at real industrial scale, began appearing across the American South in the years following the war. Born directly out of a wartime supply emergency that natural ice simply couldn't solve from 1,000 miles away. For decades after that, mechanical and natural ice coexisted in an uneasy, mostly natural ice favoring truce, mostly because of simple economics. Producing ice mechanically required substantial capital investment in machinery and a continuous, expensive supply of coal to power it, while natural ice required only the labor to cut and store something the winter had already produced for free. As long as a cold New England winter reliably delivered enough ice every January, mechanical refrigeration remained the more expensive, more complicated alternative, interesting in theory, hard to justify economically in practice, especially anywhere within reach of an established natural ice supply chain like the Hudson Valleys. What finally tipped the balance wasn't cost. It was fear, a specific, increasingly well-documented fear, that the very water these companies were cutting their product from might be making people sick. The problem was straightforward in retrospect, and it should have been obvious from the start. As American cities grew through the second half of the 19th century, the rivers and lakes near those cities increasingly served double duty as both sources of drinking water and as dumping grounds for sewage, industrial runoff, and general urban waste. Ice doesn't purify the water it's frozen from. Whatever was floating in a river or lake when it froze stayed locked into that block of ice, fully intact, ready to be released the moment the ice melted back into someone's drink, their food, or the meltwater dripping through their icebox onto food stored below it. A river ice operation harvesting from a waterway that was also receiving a city's sewage upstream wasn't selling pure refrigeration. It was, in the worst cases, selling a slow-release vector for exactly the diseases ice was supposed to help prevent. Typhoid fever became the specific disease most closely and persistently associated, in public discussion, with contaminated natural ice, a connection that made intuitive sense, since typhoid spreads through contaminated water and food, and ice that had been cut from a polluted source was, mechanically, both of those things at once. Newspapers and medical commentators throughout the later decades of the 19th century repeatedly raised the alarm about this connection, and the concern grew serious enough that some jurisdictions moved to ban ice harvesting outright from waterways judged too contaminated to be safe. A remarkable regulatory step for an era not generally known for aggressive public health intervention, and a clear signal of how legitimate the underlying fear had become. This is exactly why Rockland Lake's spring-fed purity had mattered so much commercially from the very start, why the Astor House had been willing to advertise it by name on a menu decades earlier. Pure wasn't a marketing flourish in this context. It was a genuine, specific, scientifically grounded claim about a real and growing public health risk that competing operations, harvesting from increasingly compromised rivers and lakes closer to dense population centers, simply could not make with a straight face anymore. Manufactured ice had a structural advantage here that no amount of careful site selection could fully replicate for the natural ice industry. A mechanical ice plant could control its water source completely, filtering and treating municipal tap water before freezing it, guaranteeing a level of purity that depended on process rather than on the happy geological accident of a particular lake's spring feeding. As public anxiety about waterborne disease grew through the closing decades of the century, fueled by a genuine, ongoing wave of typhoid outbreaks in American cities, artificial ice, a phrase that had once carried connotations of unnatural, almost suspicious novelty, started to flip its meaning entirely. It began to read, instead, as the safer, more modern, more scientifically reliable choice. Natural ice, the product an entire industry had spent nearly a century building into essential American infrastructure, increasingly found itself rebranded, fairly or not, as the riskier option, old-fashioned, uncontrolled, dependent on the unpredictable cleanliness of whatever body of water happened to freeze that winter. The economics caught up gradually rather than all at once. By 1907, by one period estimate, Americans were still consuming something like 15 million tons of ice annually across roughly 2,000 commercial ice plants nationwide. But a meaningful and rapidly growing share of that supply was now coming from mechanical manufacture rather than from a harvested lake, a balance that would have been almost unthinkable a generation earlier. The natural ice industry's own internal logic, the thing that had made it work in the first place, a product literally free to produce, requiring only labor and a cold winter to harvest, started to look less like an advantage and more like a liability the moment a meaningful fraction of customers started actively asking where their ice had come from and what exactly might have been swimming in the water before it froze. It's worth pausing here because there's a real irony sitting at the center of this entire pivot, one that the people living through it could only partly see. The natural ice trade had survived corrupt monopolists, brutal labor conditions, and a devastating heat wave that exposed exactly how fragile and exploitable the whole system could be. What finally started pulling the ground out from under it wasn't any of that, wasn't outrage, wasn't reform, wasn't a regulator finally cracking down on Charles Morse's successors. It was a quiet, accumulating loss of trust in the product itself, built one typhoid scare at a time, by a public that had simply started to wonder, reasonably, whether the thing keeping their food cold might also be the thing that was making them sick. And once that doubt had taken root, the natural ice industry's last and best defense, that it was simply cheaper, and that mechanical refrigeration was an expensive, unreliable novelty, was about to run headlong into a piece of technology that would make manufactured cold not just safer, but finally, genuinely, affordable enough for an ordinary household to own outright. Once that happened, the entire question of which lake your ice came from and who controlled the dock it landed at would stop mattering to anyone at all. The cold that replaced winter, here's the strange thing about the technology that finally killed the natural ice trade. It didn't arrive as a single dramatic breakthrough. It crept in, appliance by appliance, decade by decade, mostly aimed at industry and commerce long before it ever showed up in an ordinary household kitchen. And by the time it finally did reach the kitchen, the change happened fast enough that an entire industry built over 100 years collapsed within a single generation. Industrial mechanical refrigeration had been quietly winning ground for decades before home refrigerators became a realistic prospect at all. Brewers, meat packers, and large-scale food distributors had increasingly strong financial incentives to invest in mechanical cooling, ammonia compression systems, refined out of the basic principles Gorey had pioneered decades earlier by inventors like Ferdinand Carré and Charles Tellier, because at industrial scale, the upfront cost of machinery and fuel could be justified by the elimination of an unreliable seasonal harvest and an increasingly suspect water source. Refrigerated rail cars, breweries, and large cold storage warehouses had been gradually shifting toward mechanical cooling throughout the final decades of the 19th century, even while the household icebox, with its daily delivered block from a natural ice company, remained the unchallenged standard for ordinary families. That household standard, it turns out, was the last and hardest piece of the system to dislodge, and the reason was simple economics rather than any technical limitation. Early electric refrigeration units for home use existed well before most people could plausibly afford one. General Electric marketed a wood cabinet model called the Audifren as early as 1911, designed by a French monk, priced at $1,000, twice the cost of an automobile at the time, a price point that made it, functionally, a luxury novelty for the wealthy rather than a genuine alternative to the Iceman for the average household. A small device called the DOMELRE, released in 1914, tried a different approach, designed to retrofit into an existing icebox rather than replace it outright. It offered better temperature control than a melting ice block, but it wasn't reliable or cheap enough to displace the established daily delivery habit most families had built their entire food storage routine around. The pieces started clicking into place faster after 1916, when an engineer named Alfred Mellows developed a genuinely self-contained home refrigerator, with the compressor mounted at the bottom of the cabinet, rather than as a separate, intimidating piece of industrial equipment bolted nearby. General Motors executive William C. Durant recognized the commercial potential immediately, bought out Mellows' small operation in 1918, and relaunched it under a new name that would go on to become a household word in its own right, Frigidaire. The same year, a competing Detroit-based operation introduced the first home refrigerator with genuinely automatic temperature control, under a brand named, with a certain amount of scientific cheek, after the physicist who defined the concept of absolute zero Kelvinator. By 1923, Kelvinator alone controlled something like 80% of the entire American market for electric home refrigerators, in an industry that, just 5 years earlier, had barely existed in any form an ordinary family could afford. None of these early machines were what you'd call safe, exactly, by modern standards. They relied on refrigerant chemicals, sulfur dioxide, methyl chloride, ammonia, that were genuinely, seriously toxic if a seal failed and the gas leaked into a kitchen. Leaks happened. The machines were loud, the compressors ran hot, and by 1923 there were already 56 separate companies racing to manufacture competing models, most of them using one or another of these dangerous compounds, in a market that hadn't yet settled on safety as a primary selling point. The real turning point, the moment the home refrigerator stopped being an interesting curiosity for the wealthy and started becoming the appliance that would eventually make the Iceman extinct, arrived in 1927, when General Electric introduced a model the public almost immediately nicknamed the Monitor Top, after the unmistakable resemblance between its exposed, cylindrical, top-mounted compressor and the rotating gun turret on the Civil War ironclad warship USS Monitor. It launched at $525, still a substantial sum, but a fraction of the $1,000 price tags that had defined the category a decade earlier, and within a few years, as production scaled and competition intensified, comparable models were selling for as little as $200. It was, by most accounts, the first home refrigerator genuinely affordable enough for a real cross-section of the American middle class, and it sold more than 1 million units before its production run ended. Once that price threshold broke, the rest of the transition moved with startling speed. Throughout the 1930s, helped along by New Deal-era loans and the rapid spread of rural electrification, both of which put reliable household electricity within reach of a far larger share of the country than had ever had it before, electric refrigerators went from a novel middle-class purchase to something close to a default expectation for any American kitchen. The discovery and adoption of Freon as a stable, dramatically safer refrigerant in the early 1930s removed the lingering safety concerns that had haunted the earlier generation of toxic gas appliances, clearing away one of the last credible objections a cautious household might still have raised. By the late 1930s, the icebox, the simple, gravity-fed, daily resupplied wooden cabinet that had defined American food storage for the better part of a century, had been functionally replaced in the great majority of American homes, not by government mandate or industry collapse, but simply because the alternative had become better, safer, and within reach. Back at Rockland Lake, the company that had spent a century building one of the largest, most sophisticated natural ice operations in the world watched this happen, and for a remarkably long time, simply refused to believe its own product was finished. Company executive Robert McClay articulated the Knickerbocker Ice Company's official position with a confidence that reads, in hindsight, as almost touchingly stubborn. He argued that the cost of manufacturing ice, even setting aside the additional expense of making it chemically pure, would always preclude artificial ice from ever competing profitably against ice formed by nature's own hand. It is the kind of statement that sounds entirely reasonable right up until the moment it becomes obviously, completely wrong. The end, when it came, arrived quickly. The Knickerbocker Ice Company harvested its final block of natural ice from Rockland Lake in 1924, 93 years after the operation had begun there, and just 3 years before General Electric's Monitor Top would put the final nail in the coffin of the entire household natural ice market nationwide. The company didn't disappear. It pivoted by 1928 into operating 10 manufactured ice plants of its own in Brooklyn, producing artificial ice from filtered New York City tap water. The same company, the same brand name, now selling the exact technology that had spent decades putting its original product out of business, because surviving as a business mattered more in the end than any loyalty to the method that had built it. The lake itself got one last, almost mythic coda. In 1926, as demolition crews moved in to tear down the now obsolete ice houses standing empty along Rockland Lake's shore, the sawdust insulation that had spent nearly a century keeping the company's product frozen, the same hazard described back when we talked about the dangers of the job itself, caught fire during the teardown. It burned with the speed and ferocity that sawdust and dry wood construction always promised and rarely delivered on this scale, and the fire that resulted very nearly consumed the entire village of Rockland Lake along with the buildings it had started in. The single largest catastrophic event in the operation's 100-year history happened not during a harvest, not during a storm, not during any of the dangers we'd spent real time worrying about earlier in this story, but during the act of tearing the whole thing down, as if the industry, on its way out the door, wanted to leave one last reminder of exactly how much risk had been quietly baked into its infrastructure the entire time. By the time that fire burned itself out, the broader story was already over in every way that mattered. The Iceman's daily round, the window card announcing whether you wanted 25 pounds or 100, the 800 men converging on a frozen lake every January, the barges riding low in the water down the Hudson, the entire elaborate, dangerous, century-old machine built to manufacture cold out of nothing but winter and labor. All of it was being quietly, completely replaced by a small white metal box that sat in the corner of the kitchen, plugged into the wall. And simply never stopped working. Nobody mourned it especially loudly at the time, which is its own kind of telling detail. The men who'd risked frostbite and drowning every January for $1 a day weren't sentimental about the job disappearing. Reliable, less dangerous work was, for almost anyone who'd actually done the harvest, an unambiguous improvement. The families who'd once depended on the Iceman's daily reliability weren't nostalgic for window cards and melting blocks. A refrigerator that never needed restocking, never dripped through the floor, and never ran out during exactly the week you needed it most was, by every reasonable measure, simply better. The industry didn't get killed by outrage over the ice trust scandal, or by public health crusaders successfully banning contaminated harvests, or by any dramatic act of reform at all. It got killed in the end by something far more ordinary and far more permanent, a better product, finally cheap enough for everyone to have one,